This is how I line up the seam on my leg band with the seam on my crotch. So I attach my leg band on the outside of my bummies with my print facing out. Basically what I do is I will take the seam on my bummies and I will pin it directly on top of the crotch seam of my bummy, and then this other pin I pin to the side seam over here on the bummies. Okay, so I take my leg band seam, I stick my hand inside my bummies like this, and then I literally overlap them and lay them right on top of each other. So I just make sure that this line on my leg band is laying right on top of that one. Have these all nice and lined up on top of each other. I am going to take a pin and then I'm going to pin it right there before my seam. And then as I'm sewing these, I do this thing with my fingers so that I make sure they stay together. So I'll show you that. And then our other pin on our leg band, we are going to match up with the other side seam on our bummies. Just go ahead and pin that. And then I start sewing. You can either start over here going towards the seam or over here going towards the seam. I want to go over my seam first so that I can make sure that it's lined up perfectly. So I'm just going to take this over to my serger and slide it on where my seam is one of the first things I'm going to be going over. So I'm going to go ahead and slide my bummies on so that my seam is one of the first things I'm going to be going over. So I'm just going to adjust this and make sure that all of my fabrics are lined up from that first pin back here to where we're going to be sewing towards on our seam. So make sure that all your fabrics are nice and lined up before you start sewing. And we're going to start sewing somewhere in here. Lift your presser foot, go ahead and slide this underneath. Lower your presser foot, and you're only going to stretch your band. So I stick my hand underneath my band. I do it with this hand. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and as I am serging, I'm going to adjust it with my other hand and keeping my other hand underneath my leg band so that I can stretch and adjust these fabrics as I go. And so now I am coming up to my seam. So I'm going to take my pin out. And so there is the seam on my leg band and there's the seam on my bummy. And I stick my fingers right in the seam on my leg band. And as I do that, I kind of lift it up a little bit and make sure that I can feel through my leg band that it is directly over top the seam on my bummies. So I'll put my fingers straight down on my bummies so that they stay together as I sew. See, I'm still holding it with my fingers, and once I get past it, I'll continue sewing as normal. Still only stretching my leg band to my next pin. Now we're coming up to our next pin, so go ahead and cut this off right here and continue serging. And as you come up to where you first started sewing on your leg band, we're just going to overlap that a few inches. And then you're just going to taper off, cut your tail, and then I will pull these strings out and then I'll cut it, and then I usually take a little lighter and just burn down any of the extra strings. So then when you flip your leg band out, you'll see that your seams are pretty close, if not perfectly lined up with that crotch seam. So this is why I line my leg band seams up with my crotch seam, because when a child is wearing this, you're not really even going to be able to see that, okay? Because their legs are going to be going through the leg holes. So you're not going to see it like you would if it was on this side seam over here, because if you don't line that up perfectly, you're going to be able to see it. So I like to do it down here in the crotch area. It's just what I like to do better. It's totally a preference thing, but if you're starting out, that's what I recommend you start out with. And this fabric is actually double brush poly. So in my opinion, I think it's better to start out learning to sew bummies with double brush poly, a knit, rib knit, something like that. I know a lot of people try to use bullet, but bullet is a very thick fabric and it doesn't have as much stretch as a knit or a double brush poly would. So I recommend trying those out first before you try the bullet.